A good translator is a writer. Translation is a type of creative writing. This video is brought to you by Beer Joy. Right now they are running a special promotion for Joffrey the Giant viewers. Joffrey15 is your discount code for 15% off everything. Joffrey15, all in caps. Check them out. Beer Joy. So, here I am in Red Lodge, Montana, enjoying the constant sounds of the creek right by my room. I've been reading a good bit of Jane Kenyon recently, her book, The Boat of Quiet Hours. She's a poet. For those of you who are in Moscow, Idaho, where we live, there was a sale at Palouse Books a little while back. There were a bunch of poetry volumes put out on their little $1 table. And this is one of the volumes I picked up. Hadn't really been familiar with her. I'd heard her name, but really been enjoying it. And she had a personal project throughout her life of translating this one particular Russian poetess. And you know, it kind of got me thinking about translation again. Translation is something that interests me a great deal. I have a big interpretation project coming up soon of simultaneous translation. That will be an interesting challenge for me. I've always been interested in seeing how people translate poetry, particularly with the languages I speak. So I own several bilingual editions of Spanish to English poetry. So, you know, you see the Spanish on one side, the English on another. And it's always interesting to see what choices the translators make. Poetry in particular brings out a lot of unique challenges for translators. And poetry and translation gets me thinking about imagination and translation. And every Christian, I think, is interested to one degree or another in translation because the Bible is so important to a Christian. And translating the Bible, like how that happens, is a never-ending conversation. So, I'll tell you what my personal tendency, if not philosophy, in translating texts is. I tend to want to go kind of literal. Now, it's just a tendency. Like, I don't do it across the board. This is what I mean when I say that translating is creative writing, right? You don't get to appropriate the text and you know, just make it all your own, right? You're trying to translate someone else's work and convey it to someone who doesn't speak that original language. But it's still creative writing, and you want to not only put yourself in the seat of the reader, but you also, as a writer in translating, I think you want to exercise their imagination. And that's actually why I tend to go kind of literal. So, for example, idioms. Idioms are a challenge. And they tend to be replaced. Look for, you know, one-on-one equivalence, right? Like, he didn't even get to first base. How do you translate that into a language where baseball's not really a thing? Or even how do you translate that into Japanese, where baseball is a thing, but convey that same meaning, right? So what most translators try to do is to find an equivalent of the core meaning of the idiom. My tendency is to want to translate it literally and make the reader imagine. There are some things that you just know you're going to lose when you translate. There are sacrifices you have to make. But I think by and large, when you try to stay a little more literal in your translation, you preserve things like double meanings. You preserve things like parallelism. And I think you have to kind of get into the soul of things a little more as well. I mean, there's flexibility. For example, right now I'm working on a translation. I say I'm working on. For years I've dabbled in occasionally translating little bits of El Cantar del Mio Cid, the epic Spanish poem about the Cid. Maybe you've seen the Charlton Heston movie, The Cid, C-I-D. And, it's interesting because, Spain, as we know, it comes from the Goths, Romanized Goths. The reason there are a lot of names that are German and Spanish, right? Like Alfredo, Alberto. These are German names, Adolfo, that are Spanish as well, because of the Visigothic kingdoms. And so El Cid is fascinating because it has the Germanic epic poem structure of each line having a caesura in the middle, but it tends to work a little more with the elongation of vowel sounds and with Latin rhythm. I am trying to incorporate a lot of Anglo-Saxon, I suppose, features. I'm not looking to rhyme. I'm looking for alliteration. I'm looking for very Anglo-Saxon rhythm when I'm making the translations, because I want to preserve some of that Gothic flavor, even though it's a Latin language. And that's a choice I've made, right? And one has to accept as a translator that that's what you're going to be making decisions for your reader. But one of the ways you can alleviate that and make the reader exercise their imagination and put them in the place of the culture is to be kind of literal. And we see that in the Bible a lot, right? Like that sermon, there's this famous video of this, fundamentalist preacher talking about the passage, they that piss against the wall. Well, that gets translated as every male. Like, why would you do that? Why does any translation say every male when it's everyone that pisseth against the wall? I mean, that to me is unfaithful. But that's because translators don't see themselves as writers, and they don't see themselves as poets. They're trying to convey to you what they think is the core truth. What are they trying to say? What is God trying to say with everyone that pisseth against the wall? Oh, he's trying to say it's every male. So that's good enough. That's not good enough. That's not the translation. It's more than every male. Putting in the verse as everyone that pisseth against the wall puts you more in the place, right? It makes you imagine a little more how people lived and how people talked, and maybe even the brutality of that particular passage. So, for example, it's very, very interesting to read literal translations of Scripture. People have worked on these. The most famous is Young's literal translation. They have some problems, and and they can't be the main translation that the church relies upon. But you as a Christian, you can be reading them, and it is eye-opening. If you don't read Hebrew and Greek, and let's be honest, most people who say they read Hebrew and Greek don't. It is absolutely eye-opening, and it's eye-opening to see what kind of decisions these translators and usually committees of translators make. So, I know I'm starting to ramble a little bit, but I think it's very interesting to think about how we approach translation. I know a lot of people who watch this channel are bilingual. How we approach Scripture, how we approach poetry. And one of the underlying things in here for me is everyone ought to read more poetry, right? If we are poetry readers, then reading a text and reading a translated text, we can exercise more imagination upon it. Translators translating a text, I think, are more prepared to take on responsibility and be flexible in the right ways, instead of approaching translation as a one-to-one sort of problem or like a math equation. So, yeah, I guess one of the takeaways is everybody read a lot more poetry. Okay? But yeah, also I guess another takeaway might be if you've never actually read a literal translation or passages of literal translations of Scripture, go for it. It's eye-opening. I mean, one of the have you ever noticed in the creeds, age after age is an expression, or forever and ever. When we talk about eternity, that gets really tough. And the way different cultures talked about eternity, like we often forget that Christianity redefined time for most of humanity. I'm not going to go on a whole circular versus linear thing, but Christianity redefined time. So when you translate older languages, talking about eternity is different. So there are places in the Scripture where it would be valid to translate things as to the end of eternity. And most translators think that's a contradiction. It's contradictory to say the end of eternity. What if I walked up to my wife and said, "Baby, I will love you till the end of eternity"? The so-called contradiction has meaning, right? It's not math, y'all. All right, I'm done. Poetry for the win, y'all. Peace.